Welcome to another episode of Discograffiti's wildly in-depth Beach Boys series and Your Dreams Come True, where Brian Wilson freaks like you and me get our chance to delve deep into the barely believable history and prodigious discography of my favorite band of all time, and also coincidentally the best, along with a slew of over 50 top-shelf guests, ranging from musicians inspired by their work, family members, documentary directors, songwriting collaborators, Beach Boys authors, producers, touring band members, and for good measure, some of the Beach Boys themselves. I'm your host, Dave Gebrow, and special thanks goes out to co-producers Chuck Granata, Dennis Dykin, and Mark Freed, without whom this series would not have happened. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. If you prayed for all the things you wanted Hal Blaine to talk about in a stream of consciousness style without a filter, this is the interview you'd get. What it was like to work with an acid-addled Brian Wilson, how it felt working at the Beach Boys' home studio with the rest of the group, attempting to work with producer Joe Thomas, how it felt having Murry Wilson around, working with a wildly inebriated John Phillips, and how Hal feels he got accepted into his senior living community. This entry in the Chuck Granata Pet Sounds interview series is the second part of Chuck's chat with Brian Wilson's favorite drummer, legendary studio maestro Hal Blaine. It's not hard to understand why Brian worked with him so often. Hal claimed to have participated in over 35,000 sessions and 6,000 singles. His drumming is featured on 150 U.S. top 10 hits, 40 of which went to number 1. Chuck's interview with Hal took place while the latter was living in a retirement community, and the tone is definitely no shits given by this point. Hal passed away a few years later in 2019, which makes this posthumously released Chuck Chat yet another priceless buried treasure. Here he is then, Hal Blaine.
It wasn't until the Mamas and Papas kind of brought it out in the open a little bit later, all of a sudden, unbeknownst to us, Brian was dropping some acid. He had heard that the Beatles had done some acid and it gave them a bigger insight or something for writing songs, and he tried it and maybe got hooked on it, I don't know. And that was kind of the end of the whole thing. You know, he was up in the new house, and all of a sudden, with the sandbox and the tent, and they tried to build a little studio, we would go up there and record. I don't think anything ever came out of it. Mike Love was trying to do stuff, and Dennis was trying to do stuff. So we tried and tried and tried.
So that's when it really started to change.
Oh, it all changed there. Absolutely. You know, and he was married to
Marilyn.
Marilyn, yeah. And I keep getting these cards from Marilyn. You know, she does real estate. Another one sold. And she was always very sweet. And his in-laws were wonderful. You know, the Honeys, their parents, they were just so nice, Ginger and them. All of them, you know, we used to go over their house once in a while. It was great. They were really wonderful times. And then for Brian to start going through what he was going through, and then we hadn't seen him for a while, and all of a sudden, Brian looked like Man Mountain Dean. I mean, we would see him rushing through the house in a bathrobe, but he looked like he weighed 400 pounds. Now, that's a little exaggeration, but he looked so huge. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. And he, you know, he would never acknowledge us or anything. And now he had a huge Jerry Garcia-type beard, but bigger. And it wasn't Brian, this kid. And they bought the studio out in Santa Monica and I'd go out there. I was doing Dennis's album out there and just never saw Brian anymore, ever. And then one day Terry Melcher called me, and he said, it was such a sad time. And Terry said, look, get the crew together because we're going to go in the studio with Brian, and we're going to see what we can do. But tell the guys no laughing, no staring, you know, no jokes. This is going to be business, period. I said, fine. We got the band together. It was like a 2 o'clock call at RCA in the heart of Hollywood in the RCA building. We waited and waited and waited, and about maybe 2:40, 2:45, the door opened and Brian walked in. And he had lost a certain amount of weight, but he was still huge, and his hair was shoulder length or longer, and he kept shaking his head, like people do sometime when on something. And he never acknowledged anyone. He walked over to the piano, and the piano was over to my right. And he sat down at the piano, and he started playing the intro to something that we had done. And while he was playing, he looked over at me strange, and he said, "Do you know this song?" I said, "Yeah, Brian, I love that song, man." And he kept playing it again, the same intro. It never stopped, the intro. And he kept looking at me, "Do you know this song?" I said, "Yeah, Brian, I love it. It's one of my favorites. I just love that." He did that 3 or 4 times, and he stopped, he got up, and he walked out. We didn't see him again. God, I didn't see him for, I don't know, maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years, 2.5 years.
Wow.
And then I got a call to be a guest speaker at a Beach Boys convention in San Diego, and I went down, I got pictures of that. Brian walked in with Landy at the time, and we had a wonderful reunion, and Brian signed a lot of autographs and so forth. Then there was another Beach Boy convention somewhere, and then I was there again with Brian, and then again, it was over. Never heard from Brian. And then about, 2.5 years ago, something like that, 3 years ago, Brian called me, sounded very together. He said, "Will you work with me?" And I said, "Of course. What are you talking about?" And we got the band together. I contracted a huge orchestra, and we did this Everything I Need. Well, the way we did it, and we did it at Western, it was then Ocean Way. We did it there, huge orchestra. Brian was very together, and we did the song Everything I Need, and Wendy and Carney sang, and it was a magnificent song. It was beautiful. And we did whoever did the arrangements, we did all the stuff. Brian had wanted some of the familiar places, and I got him, the poor guy that just died, Jay Migliori, I got him Frank Morocco, the accordion player, Tommy Morgan, who always played
bass harmonica.
Yeah, whoever I could get, they came in and we did the session. Well, when we finished the session, Brian called me about 3-4 days later, which is the way he used to work. He would always have me come in the booth and listen to the track. If it was okay with me, then it was okay with him. Sort of, I don't know. Maybe he needed that kind of assurance. But we always worked that way from day one, because if it felt good, we had a good record.
Right.
We could always fix any little glitches. Anyway, we did that record, and then Brian called me in, and he had hooked up with this guy from Chicago, another producer, who was not there with us when we did the original tracks, Everything I Need. I think it was called Everything I Need. And Brian called me and he said, I want you to come in. We booked time at A&M, so bring your drums in, and we're going to listen to the track, and whatever you think it needs, we'll put on. And I said, okay, fine. And I was available, I don't know, another day or two, and we went in. Wendy and Carney were there, and this new producer, and he was bass player from Chicago. And they played me the track, and I tell you, it could almost make you cry. It was so good. I said, Brian, all I can say is this is going to be another record of the year for me. I can't tell you how much I love it, and I'm out of here. I wouldn't put anything on here. It's absolutely perfect. And he said, whatever you say, that's great. And the girls, both of the girls said the same thing. He said, if he says that's it, that's it. And this guy, he said, well, as long as you're here, let's put some more drums. And I said, well, you're hiring me. I'll do whatever you want. And he said, wherever there was a breath, put a drum here, put a drum here, put a fill here. It was nuts. Anyway, I walked away. It was over with, and I left. And then Brian sent me the record. It was probably a month later. It was the worst piece of shit I ever heard. They had taken it back to Chicago with this guy, Joe. I think his name was Joe. And this guy had put every click and bell and ding and bang and crash throughout this song. It was terrible. It was just awful.
All right, that concludes your free sneak peek into today's Patreon episode. If you want to hear the rest of it, just visit patreon.com/discograffiti and either purchase this podcast by itself for $4, or better yet, subscribe at the major tier and get access to Discograffiti's 4 weekly episodes. That's Friday's free episode, the Sunday Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound episode, which showcases Patreon members and the Elephant Six world, your Monday bonus episode, and your Wednesday early release, ad-free, super extended director's cut of that Friday's show. Please keep in mind this is entirely how I support my wife and 6-year-old son, so don't risk feeling badly about yourself by not supporting Discograffiti. Become a member so you don't miss a single thing at patreon.com/discograffiti.